The cold got to my sinuses first, I think. Not the air itself, exactly, but the way it tasted, metallic and stale, like licking a battery. It wasn't immediate, not when I first walked in. It built, a tightening behind my nose, a faint grit on my tongue. That's the first thing I remember, really. Not the size of the place or the rows of white boxes, but that taste, it's still there sometimes, even now. If I close my eyes and think about it. The warehouse was functional. That's the best way to put it. Everything built for one purpose, keeping things frozen. Concrete floor, painted a sort of institutional gray, worn smooth in the main aisles. The air hung heavy, even with the industrial fans whirring overhead, pushing the chilled air around. Pallets stacked high, wrapped in plastic, labeled with dates and product codes. The smell wasn't just cold, it was preserved. Like everything in there was holding its breath. Row numbers painted in faded orange, running the length of the building. I'd be walking those rows for 8 hours, scanning barcodes. Not exactly glamorous, but it paid the mortgage. That's what mattered. Zane was finishing up, clocking out as I walked in. He barely looked at me, just nodded towards a small workstation tucked near the loading dock and said, "Inventory lists there. Locker number 37. Don't bother trying the coffee. It's been sitting since yesterday." He had this tired look, like he hadn't slept in days, or maybe just hadn't slept well in days. I didn't ask. I didn't want to seem eager or needy. Every interaction felt like a potential negotiation these days, and I was already running on empty. The workstation was a mess. A half-eaten sandwich in a plastic bag, a crumpled energy drink can, and a stack of papers. On top was a single sheet, folded over. No name, no explanation, just the paper. I unfolded it, expecting a handover checklist or something. It was a list of rules. 1. Do not leave your personal bag, coat, or belongings unattended anywhere on the premises. Keep them with you or locked in your designated locker. Okay, sensible security, I guess. Though why it needed to be written down? 2. If your radio or communication device experiences interference in a specific location, static, cutting out, wrong voices, log the location and time. Do not try to boost the signal. That was odd. Interference? What kind of interference? I pictured a crackly signal, maybe a dead spot, probably just an old system. The whole place felt old. 3. If you notice new staining, discoloration, or markings on the walls, floor, or ceiling that were not there in the previous shift, photograph and report them. Do not approach within arm's reach. Now I was starting to wonder if this was some kind of joke, or maybe a really passive-aggressive attempt at micromanagement? Staining? Who was leaving stains in a freezer? 4. Do not touch the glass of any window, mirror, or reflective surface after 1 a.m. If a surface has a handprint already on it that you didn't make, cover it. I let out a small laugh. Seriously? A rule about touching glass? That was just weird. Probably some old superstition from a previous employee. Probably someone who'd worked here for 30 years and thought every surface was haunted. 5. If the natural light entering the building looks wrong, wrong color, wrong angle for the time of day, wrong intensity, check all exterior entry points immediately and report. Okay, this was getting a little unsettling. But still, it was probably just overcaution. A security thing. 6. Any unusual event requiring a report must be witnessed by at least one other person. A report filed by a lone witness goes into the secondary log, not the primary. That felt controlling, like they didn't trust anyone. 7. Use only the established routes between aisle 7 and the receiving bay. Do not take shortcuts through unmarked or rarely used spaces. Aisle 7 and the receiving bay. Specific. Why those two? 8. If a phone rings on the premises after 2 a.m., do not answer it. Let it ring. If it stops and immediately starts again, leave the area. A ringing phone in a cold storage warehouse? That had to be a prank. 9. If you find anyone lying down anywhere on the premises who is not a patient or resident, do not touch them. Do not speak to them. Leave the area and report. That one gave me a little prickle on the back of my neck, but I chalked it up to exhaustion. I hadn't been sleeping well, worrying about the house, about Mom's bills. My imagination was probably just running wild. 10. If you find plastic crates arranged in a spiral pattern near the loading dock, do not disturb it. Report using code Blue Canary. A spiral pattern of crates. Code Blue Canary? This was definitely a joke. A really elaborate, really strange joke. I folded the paper back up, a small smile playing on my lips. Eccentric, maybe, but ultimately harmless. Just a weird company culture. I tossed it into the bottom drawer of the workstation, grabbed my inventory scanner, and headed towards aisle 1. The sooner I got started, the sooner I could focus on something other than the mortgage and the looming possibility of losing everything. But as I walked, I kept glancing back at the workstation, at the folded paper in the drawer, and I couldn't shake the impression that Zane had left it there on purpose, that he'd been trying to tell me something without actually saying a word, and the metallic taste in my mouth seemed to get a little stronger with each step. I spent a good hour in aisle 7, mostly with frozen poultry. Boxes and boxes of individually wrapped chicken breasts, thighs, whole birds. It wasn't the worst. The smell wasn't bad. Not really. More of a cold, clean smell, like a butcher shop that had been sterilized. The worst aisles were the fish, obviously, or the stuff with a lot of spices. That lingered, but poultry was manageable. The scanner was a pain, though. It kept losing connection, forcing me to rescan the same barcode 3 or 4 times. I was starting to sweat under my thermal layers despite the sub-zero temperature. It was always something. Always a little bit of friction, a little bit of annoyance, adding up to a long, slow burn of exhaustion. I needed this job, though, badly. Each scan felt like a small victory against the notice of default sitting in a file on my laptop at home. Around 1:45 a.m., I got a message from Garrett on the warehouse intercom. He was in the office, needing someone to check the temperature gauge on the ammonia refrigeration unit in the loading bay. Said it was fluctuating. I sighed. That meant walking the length of the warehouse, which was essentially a long refrigerated tunnel, and it meant leaving my bag. I'd brought a small duffel bag with a change of socks, a granola bar, and the paperback I'd been trying to get through for the last month, some detective novel Dora had recommended. It was sitting on the chipped Formica table in the break room, next to the lukewarm coffee pot. I hesitated for a second. Zane's rules. I remembered a fragment of one something about belongings. Keep them with you, lock them up. I told myself it was ridiculous. A refrigeration unit was important. A fluctuating temperature could ruin thousands of dollars worth of product. My bag would be fine for 10 minutes. I quickly scanned the break room, making sure no one else was around, then headed toward the loading bay. The walk was colder than the aisles. The metal floor vibrated faintly with the hum of the machinery. The ammonia smell was stronger here, a chemical tang that made my eyes water. The gauge was just as Garrett had said, flickering between acceptable and slightly too warm. I jotted down the reading on my notepad and radioed back to the office. "It's reading a little high," I told Garrett. "Might want to get maintenance in here first thing." "Thanks, Kieran," he replied. "Appreciate it." I turned to head back, and that's when I remembered my bag. A little knot tightened in my stomach. I really shouldn't have left it. It was just a habit, I told myself. I'd always left my stuff in the break room at other jobs. But Zane's list, it was nagging at me. I hurried back to the break room, expecting to find everything exactly as I'd left it. And it was. The duffel bag was on the table. The coffee pot still lukewarm, a half-eaten donut abandoned on a paper napkin. Everything was normal. Except it wasn't. I unzipped the bag, needing to confirm. Socks, granola bar, book, all there, but the book wasn't lying flat. It was open, and not to the page I'd left it on. It was open to the middle, to a chapter I hadn't even started yet. I distinctly remembered closing it to page 87. This was page 152. I stared at the open book, the detective's face staring back at me. It was a small thing, easily explained. Maybe the air vent had shifted it. Maybe it had just fallen open on its own. But the air vent was across the room and the bag was zipped closed. It hadn't fallen open. I quickly zipped the bag shut again, a wave of nausea washing over me. It wasn't the temperature. The metallic taste in my mouth was back, stronger now, coating my tongue like pennies. I grabbed my bag and practically ran back to aisle 7, needing to get back to the steady rhythm of scanning, of doing something. I spent the next hour methodically scanning chicken breasts, but I couldn't shake the image of that open book. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone standing there. Someone who'd been in the break room while I was gone, but there was no one. Just the endless rows of frozen poultry and the oppressive cold. I tried to tell myself it was nothing, that I was just tired and stressed, that I was letting Zane's ridiculous list get to me. But I knew, deep down, that it wasn't nothing. And I knew that whatever it was, it had something to do with leaving my bag unattended. I kept the duffel bag clutched tight to my side for the rest of my shift, the paperback digging into my ribs. The chicken breasts were mostly done for the night. I'd gotten a good rhythm going, scanning each package, adjusting the inventory numbers on the handheld, stacking the completed pallets. It wasn't glamorous work, but it was steady, and right now, steady was all that mattered. Loretta had called earlier, asking about the mortgage payment. Just checking in, she'd said, but I could hear the worry in her voice. I told her I'd gotten the job, that things were looking up. I didn't mention Zane's list or the book or the metallic taste that seemed to cling to the back of my throat. The warehouse was quiet, as usual, mostly just the hum of the refrigeration units and the occasional creak of the metal racking. I preferred it that way. Less chance of running into someone. I wasn't much for small talk, especially not now. I'd always been a bit of a loner, but the weight of everything lately just made me want to disappear. Even the thought of Sunday chicken noodle soup felt exhausting. I was working my way down aisle 8, scanning the last few pallets of turkey tenderloins when it happened. The radio clipped to my belt started to crackle, static. It wasn't unusual. There was always a dead spot in this section, near the loading dock. The signal always broke up here. I'd mentioned it to Gord a few times, but he just shrugged it off. He said it was the metal siding interfering with the signal. I paused, waiting for it to clear. The static got worse, a harsh, grating noise that made my teeth ache. I instinctively reached for the volume control, then stopped. That's when I remembered Zane's list. Something about interference, about logging it. It was a long time ago, and I couldn't quite recall the wording. Something about not trying to fix it. It was one of the more bizarre ones I remembered thinking at the time. Probably just Zane being paranoid. I told myself it was just a coincidence. A faulty radio, bad weather. Anything but what Zane's list suggested. It was just static. I was being ridiculous. I'd been working all night, stressed about the house, worried about Loretta. My mind was playing tricks on me. I took a deep breath, trying to calm my nerves. But then the static shifted. It wasn't just noise anymore. It sounded like voices. Garbled, distorted, but definitely voices. And then for a split second, a single word broke through the static. A woman's voice, clear as a bell, saying return. It was gone as quickly as it came, replaced by the harsh crackle of static again. I froze, my hand still hovering over the volume control. Return? Return what? Return where? It could have been my imagination, a trick of the ear, but it had sounded so real. I glanced around, half expecting to see someone standing behind me. But there was no one. Just the rows of frozen turkey and the oppressive cold. I fumbled for my notepad and pen, my fingers clumsy with cold and a sudden prickling sensation on the back of my neck. I scribbled down the time, 2:47 a.m., and the location, aisle 8, approximately 10 feet from the loading dock. Then a brief note, radio interference, possible voice, heard return. I didn't bother trying to boost the signal. That rule or the impression of it stuck with me. Don't fix it, log it. I finished scanning the remaining pallets quickly. My movements jerky and uncoordinated. I wanted to get out of aisle 8 to get back to the relative safety of the main warehouse. Each creak of the metal racking sounded like footsteps. Every shadow seemed to shift and sway. I felt exposed, vulnerable, like I was being watched. I practically sprinted back to aisle 7, my heart thudding against my ribs. I needed a coffee, something hot and strong to calm my nerves. I found myself staring at the break room door, the same door I'd walked through earlier. The same place I'd left my bag. I didn't go in. Instead, I headed for the coffee machine, keeping my back to the room. I made a fresh pot, then sat at a table as far away from the door as possible, the mug warming my hands. The metallic taste in my mouth hadn't gone away. It felt like I'd been sucking on a handful of coins. I kept glancing at the radio, expecting it to erupt with static again. But it remained silent, for now. I pulled out my phone, intending to call Loretta, but I hesitated. What would I tell her? That the radio was talking to me? That I was losing my mind? I put the phone back in my pocket. I didn't need to worry her, I needed to get through the night, and I needed to remember exactly where I was when the radio spoke. I needed to remember aisle 8. I was restacking pallets in aisle 4, mostly frozen pizzas. Pepperoni, cheese, a few of those weird gourmet ones with fig and prosciutto. It wasn't bad work, honestly. Repetitive, sure, but better than wandering around listening for static. The pizzas came in these big cardboard boxes, and the tape always seemed to be half unrolled, snagging on my gloves. I spent a good 15 minutes just smoothing it down, trying to make the stacks look neat. Gord always said a tidy warehouse was a safe warehouse. I didn't really buy it, but it gave him something to yell about if things weren't perfect. The temperature in aisle 4 was consistently colder than anywhere else. I'd noticed it on previous shifts. It wasn't a dramatic difference, maybe 5 degrees, but enough to make my breath mist when I exhaled. I pulled my collar up tighter, wishing I'd worn an extra layer. My fingers were starting to ache, even through the gloves. I kept rotating them, trying to get the blood flowing. I was on my third pallet, arranging the pizzas in a pyramid shape, Gord's preference, when I glanced up and saw it. On the wall, between 2 of the metal support beams, was a stain. It wasn't a rust stain or a water stain, it was darker, almost black, but with a reddish tinge. It wasn't large, maybe a foot across, but it was irregularly shaped, like something had been smeared there, or pressed against the wall. I stopped stacking, just stared at it. I'd walked past this spot at least twice already tonight. I was sure of it. I'd even leaned against that beam for a moment while checking my inventory list. It hadn't been there then. I distinctly remember thinking the wall was relatively clean for a cold storage warehouse. My first thought was someone had spilled something, maybe a cleaning solution or some kind of industrial lubricant, but the color was wrong. And the shape, it was hard to describe. It wasn't a random splatter, it had a form, an almost organic quality. It made the back of my throat tighten. I told myself I was just tired. My eyes were playing tricks on me. The dim fluorescent lights cast strange shadows. It probably looked different than it actually was. Then Zane's list flickered through my mind. Something about markings, discoloration. I couldn't remember the exact wording, but the gist of it was there. Don't ignore new things on the walls. Don't get close. Photograph it. Report it. I briefly considered just ignoring it. Pretending I hadn't seen anything. It was probably nothing, but the image of the stain, that unsettling shape, stuck in my head. I pulled out my phone, switched on the camera, and took a picture. The flash illuminated the stain more clearly, making it even more disturbing. I hesitated, then started to type a message to Gord. But what would I say? Hey, there's a weird stain on the wall in aisle 4. He'd think I was losing it. I decided to just log it like I did with the radio interference. I scrolled through the warehouse map on my phone, looking for the nearest emergency contact number. There was a maintenance line, but it wasn't a 24-hour service. I'd have to wait until morning. That meant leaving the stain there, untouched, for the rest of the night. And that meant avoiding aisle 4. I glanced back at the stain. It seemed larger now. Or maybe it was just my imagination. I reminded myself of the rule, or the impression of it. Do not approach. Do not get within arm's reach. It sounded ridiculous, paranoid, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. I finished stacking the pizzas, deliberately avoiding looking at the wall again. I needed to finish my route, get back to the main warehouse. I had a pallet of frozen waffles to check in aisle 5, then a quick sweep of the loading dock, but the image of that stain, that unsettling shape, followed me. It was a slow burn, settling in my chest. As I walked towards aisle 5, I realized I hadn't checked the temperature logs for aisle 4. I was supposed to record the temperature of each aisle every 2 hours. I'd skipped it when I was stacking pizzas. Now I couldn't go back, not without violating the rule. The temperature in aisle 4 could be fluctuating, compromising the integrity of the frozen goods. Gord would be furious if he found out, but going back meant getting close to that stain. I kept walking, aisle 5, and then the loading dock. The aisle 4 logs would have to wait. The pallets of frozen corn were a pain. They weren't heavy, not individually, but the sheer volume and the way they were stacked always slightly off-kilter. Every other row was a leaning tower, threatening to spill its icy contents onto the floor. I was supposed to be repalletizing them, making them square and stable. It was mind-numbing work, but it kept me moving, kept me from thinking too much about the mortgage, about Mom's medical bills, about how quickly things had fallen apart. I was humming along to a static-laced country station on the radio. It was better than nothing, and trying to ignore the chill that seemed to seep into my bones no matter how many layers I wore. The warehouse was always cold, of course, but some spots were worse than others, near the loading docks especially. That's where I was now, aisle 9, right by the big bay doors. The concrete was slick with condensation, and the air smelled faintly of diesel exhaust. I finished up the last pallet, straightened the top layer of corn, and glanced at my watch. It was 2:47 a.m., another hour and a half until my break. I could almost taste the lukewarm coffee from the break room machine. I was starting to feel that familiar ache in my lower back, the one that reminded me I wasn't getting any younger. I made a mental note to stretch properly when I got home, if I even had the energy. That's when I noticed it. A small window, set high in the wall opposite the loading docks. I hadn't really paid attention to it before. It wasn't a normal window, not exactly. It was more like a viewport, reinforced glass looking into what I assumed was the old administrative offices. The building had been expanded several times over the years, and those offices were now completely sealed off, unused. I'd heard stories from some of the older guys, Zane mostly, about how the original owner had been a recluse, barely ever leaving those rooms. The glass was grimy, covered in a layer of dust and grime. But there was something else, a handprint, right in the center of the window, a dark smudge against the dirty glass. It looked fresh. I frowned, leaning closer, trying to get a better look. It wasn't a smeared print, like someone had just wiped their hand across the glass. It was defined, almost deliberate, like someone had pressed their palm flat against it. I paused, my hand hovering near my walkie-talkie. Maybe it was just a smudge, a trick of the light, but it was distinct, too distinct, and it was on the inside of the window. That didn't make any sense. Those offices hadn't been opened in years. There wasn't even a door leading into them from inside the warehouse, just that sealed-up wall. I briefly considered dismissing it. Kids probably snuck around outside, found a way to reach it somehow. It was a ridiculous thought, but it was easier than acknowledging something else was going on. Then Zane's voice echoed in my head. Not a real voice, but the memory of his gruff warning during the training. Something about glass, about not touching it after a certain hour. I couldn't remember the exact time, but the feeling of dread that accompanied the memory was enough. He'd said something about contact, about how it could work both ways. I remembered a quick, uneasy scan of the document he'd handed me, the one with all the rules. It was mostly jargon and warnings about safety protocols, but a few things had stood out. This, I realized, was one of those things. Without thinking, I rummaged in my backpack for the roll of packing paper I used to protect fragile items. I unfolded a large sheet and carefully pressed it over the handprint, smoothing it out as best I could. I didn't look back at the handprint as I covered it. I didn't want to. I didn't want to see what kind of hand had made it. I didn't want to consider when it had been made. The paper stuck, held in place by the condensation on the glass. It wasn't a perfect cover, but it was enough. I turned away from the window, my stomach twisting into a tight knot. I didn't need to know what was on the other side of that glass. I didn't need to understand how a handprint could appear on the inside of a sealed-off room. I just needed to move on. I quickly finished my pallet check of aisle 9, then headed back towards the main warehouse, my pace quickening. I avoided looking at the window again. I avoided looking at that wall entirely. I just focused on putting one foot in front of the other, on getting through the rest of my shift. The radio was silent now, the static having completely swallowed the music. I didn't bother trying to adjust it. The silence felt safer. I had a sudden, overwhelming urge to be somewhere else. Anywhere else. But I was stuck here, in this cold, echoing warehouse, with the image of that handprint burned into the back of my mind, and the unsettling certainty that something, somewhere, had just touched back. I was stacking pallets of frozen waffles in aisle 3, trying to ignore the ache in my lower back. It was a repetitive task, thankfully. Stack 4 high, then move on to the next pallet. The air was consistently 15 degrees, and the only sound was the hum of the refrigeration units and the whir of the automated forklifts in the distance. Not a bad shift, considering just cold. I kept blowing on my hands, even with the gloves on. My fingertips were starting to feel numb, that prickly, burning kind of numb. I'd finished the first row of pallets, a dozen of them, when I noticed the light. It was coming through the high windows at the end of the aisle, the ones facing east. Not much light usually makes it in there. That side of the building is mostly obstructed by the loading bays, but today it was different. It wasn't the brightness so much as the color. Everything inside the warehouse was bathed in a peculiar amber glow, like looking through a heavily tinted filter. I stopped stacking and looked up, squinting. The sunlight streaming through the glass wasn't harsh or golden. It was thick, like honey. I hadn't seen sunlight like that since that week of smoke from the wildfires last summer. Only the air was clear. There were no wildfires for hundreds of miles. I walked closer to the window, stepping carefully between the pallets. I glanced outside, directly at the sky. It looked normal. Pale blue, with a few wispy clouds drifting by, perfectly ordinary. A couple of birds were flying overhead, silhouetted against the clear horizon. It didn't match the light coming through the glass, though outside looked blue. Inside, everything was soaked in that strange, unnatural amber. Probably just the glass, I thought. Some kind of film or coating? Maybe the cleaning crew used a new solution that leaves a residue, or maybe it was something to do with the angle of the sun reflecting off something on the roof. It was a ridiculous explanation. I knew the kind you come up with just to avoid thinking about weirder possibilities, but it was enough for me to keep stacking waffles. I turned to reach for the next pallet, and that's when I smelled it. A faint metallic sweetness, like burnt sugar and old pennies. It wasn't strong, but it was distinct enough to stop me. I paused, sniffing the air, trying to pinpoint the source. The smell didn't seem to come from the waffles themselves or from the refrigeration units. It seemed to be coming from the light. It hit me then, a fragmented memory, a feeling dredged up from the training. Zane's voice, droning on about safety protocols and something about light, about watching for changes in the light, about checking the doors if the light looked wrong. I couldn't remember the exact wording, but the gist was clear. Something about the light being a warning, a sign that something wasn't right on the outside. The recollection settled like ice in my stomach. Without thinking, I started walking toward the nearest exit, the metal door at the end of the aisle. I had to check it. Had to make sure it was sealed properly, hadn't been tampered with. I pushed past a stack of frozen pizzas, nearly knocking them over, and adjusted my gloves. My hands felt clammy. But then I heard it, a scraping sound coming from the far end of the aisle near the loading docks. A sound too rhythmic to be random, like something dragging across concrete. It wasn't loud, but in the quiet of the warehouse, it was impossible to ignore. It cut through the hum of the machines, the chill in the air, and my escalating anxiety. I stopped, frozen. The exit was only about 20 feet away. All I had to do was reach it, check the locks, and make sure everything was secure. But the sound, the scraping sound, was getting closer. And I remembered the handprint. Just a day ago. The rule about reflective surfaces. The feeling I should be observing things, not touching or interacting. My thoughts felt thick, sluggish, as though wading through mud. I lowered my hand, abandoning the thought of the door. Instead, I turned slowly towards the sound, fighting the urge to run in the opposite direction. The amber light cast long, distorted shadows across the floor, making it hard to see what was making the noise. I pulled my flashlight from my pocket, clicking it on, and started walking cautiously toward the loading docks, listening for the scraping to stop, praying it would reveal something explainable, something ordinary. I was recalibrating the temperature sensors on the frozen vegetable pallets in aisle 6. Tedious work, but it had to be done. Each sensor had a tiny plastic cap, and half of them were missing, likely knocked off by the forklift drivers. I was replacing them, one by one, pulling the new caps from a plastic bag and twisting them into place. The plastic felt slick and cold against my numb fingertips, even through my gloves. I tried to remember if Mom had ever bought those pre-cut frozen vegetable mixes. She always preferred to buy fresh whole vegetables and spend an hour chopping them herself. She said it tasted better. The hum of the refrigeration units was constant, a low thrumming that vibrated through the floor. It usually faded into the background, but tonight it felt off. Not louder exactly, but higher-pitched, almost a whine. I dismissed it, probably just tired, I thought. These overnight shifts blurred everything together. The same cold, the same fluorescent lights, the same stacks of frozen food. It was enough to make you imagine things. I was on the third pallet when I noticed Ines. She was walking quickly down the aisle, heading toward the loading docks. She wasn't running, but she definitely wasn't strolling. I hadn't seen her since the orientation. She usually worked days, I'd gathered from Zane. She glanced over at me as she passed, her face pale under the lights. She didn't say anything, just nodded briefly and kept walking. That was strange. Ines was always chatty, according to Zane. He said she could talk the ear off a brass monkey. To see her looking like that, moving so fast, and not even greeting me, it felt wrong. The amber light seemed to intensify around her as she walked, making her look almost washed out. Then came the sound, a loud, metallic clang, like someone had dropped a heavy steel container. It came from behind the pallet, directly in front of me, the one I was currently working on. It made my shoulders jump, and I nearly dropped a handful of sensor caps. I listened intently, but the sound didn't repeat, just silence, except for the ever-present hum of the refrigeration units and the faint whine I'd noticed earlier. I told myself it was just something falling off the forklift, or maybe a pallet shifting. This place was full of noises, but something felt different this time. It was a heavier sound, more resonant, and it had been followed by that stillness. The way all the other sounds seemed to quiet down for a moment. And then I remembered Zane's voice during the training. Something about witnessing, about reporting, about the rules for reporting incidents. There was a specific rule. I pictured it now vaguely, about needing another person to verify anything out of the ordinary. No solo accounts, he'd said, or something like that. About how reports from one person alone were less reliable, distorted, and went into a different file, a secondary log. I straightened up, leaving the sensor caps scattered on the pallet. I needed to find Ines. I needed to ask her if she heard the sound. I needed to confirm that what I thought I'd heard was actually real. It was a stupid idea, I realized, chasing after someone who was clearly upset and potentially trying to avoid me. But the rule, the fragment of the rule I'd remembered, it was insistent. If I reported it alone, it wouldn't matter. It wouldn't be taken seriously. I started walking quickly after her, pushing past the pallets, my flashlight beam dancing across the frozen vegetables. She was almost at the loading dock now, disappearing into the shadows. "Ines," I called out, trying to keep the panic out of my voice. "Ines, did you hear that?" She didn't respond. I picked up my pace, rounding the corner of the last pallet, and stopped dead. She wasn't at the loading dock. She was gone. The loading dock was empty. The large metal doors were closed, sealed tight, and there, on the concrete floor, directly in front of the doors, was a perfect circle. Not painted, not drawn, but discolored. The concrete within the circle was a lighter shade than the surrounding floor, as if something had bleached it. The circle was about 6 feet in diameter and perfectly symmetrical. I spent a good minute just staring at it, my breath clouding in the cold air. My initial thought was someone had spilled something, a cleaning agent perhaps, something that had reacted with the concrete. But it was too precise, too clean, and the discoloration felt unnatural, unlike anything I'd ever seen. The amber light seemed to pool within the circle, making it glow faintly. I pulled out my radio, my hand clumsy with cold. I needed to report this, but I knew, even before I spoke, what the outcome would be. No one else had seen it. It was a solo incident. "Dispatch, this is Kieran in aisle 6, I said, my voice raspy. "I have a situation at the loading dock, requesting someone come take a look." "Roger that, Kieran." came the reply, a bored voice from the other end. What's the issue? There's a discoloration on the floor. A circle. I don't know what caused it. It's near the loading doors. A discoloration? All right, we'll send Garrett to check it out. Give him 10 minutes. 10 minutes? Garrett wouldn't see it. It would be gone. I knew it, with a certainty that chilled me to the bone. By the time Garrett arrived, the circle would have vanished. It would just be normal, stained concrete. I'd look like an idiot, and my report would go into the secondary log, the one that nobody ever read. I hung my head. I documented the incident in the secondary log, as required, noting the exact coordinates of the circle, the dimensions, the color. It felt useless, pro forma, like something I was doing to avoid getting fired, not to actually address a problem. I stared at the words on the screen, the cold light reflecting in my eyes. Before leaving the loading dock, I glanced back at the circle one last time. It hadn't changed. It was still there, a pale, unsettling void on the concrete floor. And beneath the hum of the refrigeration units, I was almost certain I could hear, faintly, the echo of that metallic clang. I felt a pressure behind my eyes, a dull ache. My jaw felt tight, and involuntarily I began grinding my teeth. I hadn't felt like that since the hospital. I squeezed my eyes shut, trying to dispel the memory. I just wanted to finish my shift. The pallets of frozen chicken were always the worst. Not the temperature, exactly, though the chill seemed to seep into your bones even through the thermal suit. It was the smell, not a bad smell exactly, just pervasive, a sweet, sickly odor that clung to the back of your throat. It reminded me of Mom's kitchen, actually. She used to brine chicken for days before roasting it, and that same sugary, salty scent would fill the house. I hadn't thought about that in years. I was pulling inventory in aisle 3, scanning the barcodes with the handheld scanner, trying to get ahead of schedule. Gord had called out sick, said his kid had the flu, which meant I was doing 2 people's work, and the overtime was looking less like a blessing and more like a sentence. The scanner beeped, registering another pallet. Lot 74B, quantity 112, I mumbled, logging the information into the system. The air was heavy, thick with moisture. Every breath felt like inhaling ice. I needed to get to aisle 7 to check the incoming shipment of frozen peas. It was on the other side of the warehouse, near the receiving dock. Normally, I'd take the main aisle, the one with the clearly marked yellow line down the center, but that added at least 5 minutes to the trip, weaving between the packed rows. There was a shortcut, a narrow passage between pallets of frozen fish and boxes of canned goods. It wasn't officially a route, not really, just a space that had opened up over time as they rearranged things. It wasn't blocked or anything. I glanced at the clock. 2:47 a.m. I was already behind. If I took the shortcut, I could be back in aisle 3 in 15 minutes, tops. 15 minutes I desperately needed. I told myself it wasn't a big deal. It was just a slightly faster way to get where I needed to go. I could see the end of the aisle, the faint light from the receiving dock. It was just a few steps. I slipped between the pallets. The air here was different, colder, damper. It smelled like brine and something else, something metallic, but faint. I dismissed it as the fish. It was a tight squeeze, and I had to angle my body to avoid scraping against the cardboard boxes. The floor was uneven, covered in a slick layer of ice. I could hear the hum of the refrigeration units, a constant droning sound that seemed to vibrate through my teeth. The passage was narrower than I remembered, and darker. The overhead lights didn't reach this far, and I had to rely on the small flashlight attached to my scanner. As I moved deeper, I noticed something odd, a layer of dust. Not the usual warehouse dust, the kind that settled on everything, but a fine, almost powdery dust. It coated the pallets, the boxes, even the floor. And it was undisturbed. There weren't any footprints, any tire marks, nothing. It was then I remembered something I'd skimmed over in the employee handbook. Something about established routes, something about not deviating from them. A warning, almost casually worded, something about areas that hadn't been claimed by regular passage. It wasn't a hard rule, not like the one about unattended belongings, but it was there. A little footnote at the bottom of a page. I couldn't recall the exact wording, just the feeling of unease it had evoked, a sense that some places were best left alone. I paused. I could turn back. It would add time to my route, but it wasn't the end of the world. It was probably nothing, just an unused space. But the dust that was unsettling. It felt like I was the first person to walk through here in a long time, maybe ever. I shook my head. Don't be ridiculous, I thought. It's a warehouse. People rearrange things all the time. This passage probably opened up a week ago. You're just being paranoid. The overtime is getting to you. I pressed on, pushing deeper into the narrow space. The dust got thicker, and the silence, which had been noticeable before, became absolute. The hum of the refrigeration units seemed to fade, replaced by a ringing in my ears. I shone my flashlight ahead, and that's when I saw it. A section of the wall about 10 feet long that was different. Not a different color exactly, but subtly altered. The concrete seemed smoother, almost polished, and there were no markings on it. No scratches, no dents, no graffiti. Just a blank, pristine surface in the midst of a grimy industrial landscape. I stopped dead. The scanner slipped in my hand, nearly falling to the floor. I stared at the wall, my breath catching in my throat. It wasn't just the smoothness or the lack of markings. It was the feeling, a sense of emptiness. Like something was missing. Like this section of the wall hadn't been touched by time, or by people. It felt wrong. I backed away slowly, my boots crunching on the dusty floor. I turned around and practically ran back the way I came, ignoring the narrow space, the tight squeeze, the potential for falling. I didn't stop until I was back in aisle 3, surrounded by the familiar stacks of frozen chicken. I leaned against a pallet, my chest heaving, trying to catch my breath. My jaw ached. I started grinding my teeth again. I didn't report it. What was I going to say? I took a shortcut and found a smooth wall. It would be another solo incident, another entry in the secondary log, and Garrett would still find nothing. I just wanted to finish my shift. I glanced at the clock. 3:02 a.m. I was even further behind now. I started scanning the pallets again, trying to focus on the task at hand. But I couldn't shake the image of that wall, that smooth, empty wall, and the dust, all that undisturbed dust. I knew, with a sickening certainty, that no one had walked through that passage in a very long time, and that by walking through it, I had noticed it. I'd made it known. I felt a prickling sensation on the back of my neck, and the smell of brine and something metallic seemed to have followed me back to aisle 3. I was checking expiration dates on the frozen pizzas. Aisle 7. It's the most boring part of the job, honestly, just endless rows of pepperoni and cheese, all neatly stacked and labeled, but it's methodical. I can get into a rhythm, and right now I needed a rhythm, needed something to block out the everything. The house, the bills, the feeling that I was slowly sinking. The scanner beeped with each box, the numbers scrolling across the screen. October 27th, 2024. Good. Still good. I was maybe a quarter of the way through the aisle. Loretta usually does this section, but she called out sick yesterday. Said it was the flu. Garrett just rolled his eyes and told me to cover it. Didn't even ask if I could. I reached for another pizza, a generic brand with a picture of a smiling family on the box. And that's when the phone rang. It wasn't the radio, and it wasn't coming through the scanner. It was the actual office phone, the landline, sitting on the small desk at the end of the aisle. I frowned. Who would be calling the warehouse this late? It was almost 4:30 a.m. I glanced at the clock. It rang again and again. And a fourth time, then it stopped. A brief silence, just long enough for me to start thinking about ignoring it. Maybe it was a wrong number. Then it rang again, before the silence had fully settled. That's when it clicked. Something about the way the handbook was worded. I'd skimmed it, of course, didn't read it cover to cover. Who has time for that? But I remembered a section. Something about phones, about not answering them after a certain hour. Something about it not being real calls. Just a test, maybe, or a warning. It wasn't a strict rule, not like the belongings thing. More of a precaution. A footnote. I couldn't remember the exact wording, but the impression was clear. Don't pick up. Honestly, it was probably just a glitch in the system. Old wiring. The phone company messing up. But the way it had rung, stopping and starting, it felt deliberate, and the handbook, as useless as it mostly was, had been pretty specific about after-hours calls. It had stuck with me, a little seed of dread planted in the back of my mind. I just wanted to get through the shift. I didn't answer it. I couldn't. It felt wrong. Like answering would be an invitation. To what? I had no idea. I turned my back on the phone and resumed scanning pizzas, ignoring the insistent ringing. It continued for a long time, maybe 10 rings, 15. I didn't count. I just focused on the boxes, on the numbers, on the monotonous beep of the scanner. The ringing finally stopped, but the silence that followed wasn't peaceful. It was expectant, like something was waiting. Then I remembered my mother's medication. I'd promised Dora I'd pick up her prescription on my way home. She'd been having trouble sleeping and needed a refill. It was a new pharmacy, further out of town. She'd given me the number yesterday. I'd written it on a sticky note and stuck it to the phone in the office. I walked back towards the desk. The phone was silent. The sticky note was still there. The number clearly visible. I could call now, get the prescription sorted, and then finish the pizza scan. It would add maybe 20 minutes to my shift, but Dora really needed it, and I'd promised. I stared at the phone. My hand hovered over the receiver. I could just quickly call, explain the situation, and get it over with. It was the responsible thing to do, but the handprint on the window kept flashing in my mind, and the smooth wall, and the dust, and that feeling of being watched. I didn't pick up the phone. I didn't dial the number. I turned around and walked back to the pizzas. I finished scanning aisle 7, then moved on to aisle 8. Dora would have to wait. The prescription would have to wait. I'd explain it to her tomorrow. I just couldn't risk it. I couldn't risk anything else happening. It was a stupid, irrational fear, but it was there, gnawing at me. When I finished the last aisle, I went back to the office to log my inventory. The phone was still silent, but the sticky note was gone. The small yellow square had vanished from the black plastic of the phone. I scanned the desk, the floor, the surrounding area. Nothing. It was just gone. I felt a coldness settle in my stomach. It wasn't the usual warehouse chill. It was something else, and I knew with a growing dread that Dora wasn't going to be getting her prescription tonight. I was logging pallet weights in Sector Gamma, trying to get ahead. It was a ridiculous task, really, weighing empty pallets. But Gord had been on me about efficiency, about getting the inventory reconciled before the morning shift arrived. It was always something. He wasn't a bad guy, Gord. Just meticulous. Obsessive, maybe. He'd probably have a spreadsheet detailing the optimal angle to hold the scanner. The pallets in Gamma were mostly for frozen vegetables, still slick with frost in places, even after the overnight chill had settled in. I had to scrape the scanner over the metal tags, input the numbers, and then estimate the weight based on the pallet type. Tedious. My hands were starting to ache from the cold. I kept flexing them, trying to get some circulation going. I'd forgotten my gloves again. The radio was quiet, thankfully. It had been crackling all night, picking up snippets of conversations, static bursts, and that voice. Not a clear voice, just an impression of one, like someone speaking underwater. I hadn't reported it. What was I going to say? Hey Gord, the radio sounds weird? He'd tell me to check the antenna, or suggest I was imagining things. He'd probably be right. The place was old, the wiring was ancient. I was halfway through a stack of pallets, humming a tune my mother used to sing when I saw it. Around the corner, past a row of towering frozen pea stacks, a shape, lying on the concrete floor, dark against the gray. For a second, I thought it was a discarded jacket, someone from the day shift leaving something behind. But it wasn't a jacket, it was a person. He was on his back, arms outstretched, legs bent at an odd angle. He was wearing a blue uniform, like the loading crew. I couldn't see his face clearly, just a dark blur. I stopped humming. The ache in my hands disappeared. I just stood there, scanner dangling from my wrist. It was the handbook, of course. Something flickered in my memory. A section I'd skimmed, dismissed as overly cautious. Something about someone down. Not a patient, not a resident, just someone down. And not to touch, not to speak. Just leave. Report it. Probably just a guy who'd tripped, hit his head, maybe he was asleep. It was a long night, and the air was thick with the smell of ammonia from the refrigeration units. It could disorient you. I told myself he was probably just sleeping it off, a harmless, unfortunate nap on the cold concrete. I could nudge him, wake him up, and send him on his way. But the image of the handprint on the window flashed in my mind. The unnaturally amber light, the missing sticky note, and that feeling, the one that had been growing all night, that I was trespassing somewhere I wasn't supposed to be, that this place wasn't just a warehouse. I didn't move. I didn't approach him. I didn't even make a sound. The instruction was so clear, so absolute. It wasn't a suggestion. It was a directive. Don't touch, don't speak, leave. I slowly, carefully backed away, scanning the pallets as I moved, as if trying to reassure myself that this was normal, as if logging pallet weights could somehow make sense of everything. I kept my eyes fixed on the figure on the floor, even as I retreated. I didn't want to turn my back. I didn't want to lose sight of him. When I reached the corner, I turned and walked, quickly, but trying to remain calm, towards the office. My boots echoed on the concrete floor. The only sound, the radio, remained silent. I didn't report it to Gord. I couldn't. I knew without a doubt that if I told him, he'd go look. And I didn't want to know what he'd find. I didn't want to be involved. I just wanted to finish my shift and go home. I logged the last of the pallet weights, fabricated a few numbers to get the inventory balanced, and submitted the report. The system accepted it without question. It always did. I avoided looking in the direction of Sector Gamma. I focused on the numbers on the screen, on the blinking cursor, on anything but the image of the figure lying on the floor. As I clocked out, I glanced towards Sector Gamma one last time. The area was shrouded in shadow, the towering stacks of frozen vegetables obscuring the view. I couldn't see anything. But I knew he was still there. And I knew, with a chilling certainty, that I would never find out who he was, or what happened to him, or why he was lying on the cold concrete floor of a frozen vegetable warehouse in the middle of nowhere. I'd left him there, and I wouldn't be going back. I was stacking boxes of frozen okra. A stupid amount of frozen okra. They'd had a big shipment, apparently, and it was my job to get it organized in Sector Beta. It wasn't cold, not really. Not with the thermal suit. It was just monotonous. The boxes all looked the same, felt the same, smelled faintly of dirt, and something vaguely floral. I was trying to remember if Mom ever bought okra. I didn't think she did. She wasn't a big fan of anything remotely slimy. The suit wasn't comfortable, of course. It was a thick, quilted thing that made me sweat despite the sub-zero temperatures inside the warehouse. The hood muffled sounds, and the face shield fogged up if I breathed too heavily. I kept having to wipe it with the sleeve of my jacket. It was slow work. Stack 2 boxes, wipe the shield, stack 2 more. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, a constant, irritating drone. I was nearing the end of the row, just a few more boxes to go, when I saw it. Noticed it? Really? It wasn't like it jumped out at me. It was just wrong. Arranged on the concrete floor, between the pallets, was a collection of those little plastic pallet straps, the kind they use to secure the load during shipping. Usually they're just discarded, left in a tangled heap, but these were placed in a circle, a fairly precise circle about 3 feet in diameter, and within the circle, several of the straps were bent into points, radiating outwards like the spokes of a wheel. My first thought was that Zane was messing with me. He had a habit of doing that, leaving little pranks around. Once he'd filled my lunchbox with ice cubes, harmless stuff mostly, but Zane wasn't on shift tonight. And even for Zane, this was odd. It felt too deliberate, too neat. I figured maybe some maintenance worker was trying to be artistic, or maybe someone just had a weird hobby. It didn't mean anything, a couple of plastic straps. I was already reaching down, intending to kick them aside, to tidy up the space, when I remembered something. Something about arrangements, and not touching. A fragment of a rule, surfacing from the mess of things I'd read that first day. Something about reporting it, a specific code, maybe. It wasn't clear, but the feeling was strong, a prickling sensation on the back of my neck. It wasn't a logical fear. just a compulsion to not interfere. I stopped, my boot hovering inches above the plastic. The air felt colder suddenly, even through the thermal suit. The humming of the lights seemed to intensify, vibrating in my skull. My jaw tightened. I glanced around, half expecting to see Gord standing there, observing me, but the aisle was empty. I tried to tell myself it was ridiculous. Plastic straps. A circle. It wasn't going to hurt anyone. It wasn't going to do anything. It was just a mess. But I couldn't bring myself to touch it. The thought of disrupting the arrangement felt wrong, violating something I couldn't define. Then, the radio crackled. Not the usual static. This was different, a sharp, insistent burst, followed by a low, rhythmic pulse. It wasn't a signal I recognized. It wasn't even static like before. It was almost like a heartbeat, slow, deliberate, and it was coming from Sector Gamma. I hadn't been in Sector Gamma since I found him, the man on the floor. I instinctively flinched, the memory flooding back, the stillness, the cold concrete, the sense of wrongness. That's when I understood. The radio interference followed me, didn't it? It had started after the circle, after the clang. It didn't originate in Sector Gamma. It was drawn to it. I slowly, deliberately withdrew my hand, stepped back from the circle. My breath hitched in my throat. The radio continued to pulse. I needed to report it. The code, what was the code? I couldn't remember. It felt like the information was just beyond my grasp, swirling in the fog of exhaustion and fear. I pulled out my handheld scanner, intending to log the anomaly. But when I checked the screen, the note I'd made earlier about the amber light was gone. Vanished. Completely blank. I'd written it down. I was certain of it. A reminder to mention it to Gord. But now, nothing. Just a cold, empty screen. My stomach twisted. That wasn't right. The scanner never lost data. Never. I scrolled through the log, searching for any sign of the entry, but it was as if it had never existed. I looked back at the circle. The plastic straps gleamed faintly in the fluorescent light. The radio pulsed. And I knew, with a sickening certainty, that I wasn't dealing with pranks or artistic expression. I was dealing with something else entirely, something I didn't understand, something I couldn't ignore. I backed away, slowly, carefully, keeping my eyes fixed on the arrangement. I turned and walked, rapidly now, but trying to maintain some semblance of composure towards the office. I had to tell Gord. I had to tell someone. Even if they didn't believe me, I had to report it, even without the code, even without the note. I didn't look back, but I could feel it, watching me, waiting. The fluorescent lights of the parking lot felt wrong. Not the same wrong as inside, brighter somehow, more clinical, like an operating room. I hadn't noticed that before, not on the other nights. I unlocked the truck. The click of the remote sounded overly loud in the pre-dawn quiet. Gord was already gone. He had just nodded when I walked into the office, handed me my final check, and said, "Drive safe. No questions." No mention of the man on the floor, or the pulsing radio, or everything. I hadn't even bothered to try and explain it. What was the point? It would have sounded insane even to me. I just wanted to get out, to get home. The drive was automatic. I kept the radio off. I didn't need another pulsing rhythm to burrow into my skull. The highway stretched out, gray and damp. I thought about the house, about Mom's soup. It was Sunday after all. Maybe making it would help. Maybe it would feel normal for a little while. I briefly considered calling Loretta, just to hear her voice, but I stopped myself. There wasn't anything to say. And honestly, I didn't want to try and explain why I'd been so jumpy the last few weeks. She'd just tell me to find a different job. Easier said than done. I told myself it was the stress. The bills, the house, the sheer monotonous boredom of those nights. The mind plays tricks on you when you're sleep-deprived and staring at frozen chicken for 8 hours straight. That's all it was. Tricks of the light. Static on the radio. A man having a medical episode. I'd probably just misinterpreted everything, inflated it in my head. That was a habit I'd picked up after the bankruptcy, always expecting the worst. But then I pulled into the driveway and saw it. A small, perfectly circular patch of bare earth in the middle of the lawn. It hadn't been there yesterday. The grass around it was flattened, almost pressed down. Just a circle, no apparent cause. It was probably just the sprinkler system, or maybe the dog, but it made my jaw clench, and I immediately went inside and checked all the windows, every single one, making sure they were locked and sealed. The back door too, twice. The soup didn't help. I burned the carrots. I kept checking the windows while it simmered. Every time a car drove by, I'd find myself glancing towards the glass, half expecting what? I didn't know. A shadow? A discoloration? Something I couldn't define? I ended up eating it standing up, at the kitchen counter, staring out at the yard. I've been back at my old job at the hardware store for 1 week now. It's fine, mundane, predictable. But I can't shake this new habit. Every time I enter a building, any building, I scan the floor. Not looking for anything specific, just scanning. From the doorway, a slow, deliberate sweep, taking in the entire space, measuring distances, noting potential obstructions. It's automatic now. I don't even realize I'm doing it until I've already finished. Alton noticed it the other day, asked if I was looking for a dropped screw. I just shrugged and said I was checking for hazards. He laughed. I didn't. It's not about hazards. It's about making sure the path is clear, just in case. I haven't been able to stop, and I suspect I won't.